the Elizabethan Age Part II. So this is a continuation of our introduction to the Shakespeare unit. So just to kind of recap, last time we discussed Elizabethan age. We looked at religion, we looked at education, we looked at class, the class system during the Elizabethan age. We looked at a number of conflicts between the Catholics and the Protestants, between the Puritans and the Church of England. And so as we continue, we're trying to build the backdrop in which Shakespeare wrote many of his playwrights. So we're going to continue that conversation with part 2 in this introductory unit. All right, so now we're going to look at education. So boys were educated to be useful members of society. Notice the word I just mentioned, boys. Girls were not within this group. They had other roles, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. So teaching techniques during this time relied heavily on memorization and recitation. So you had to do a lot of memorizing and reciting and going over and over and over again. And included in that is memorizing and understanding Latin. Latin was a language of literacy throughout Europe. So when you went to school, the expectation was you would learn how to read Latin, how to speak in Latin, and things of that nature. Boys started grammar school at the age of 6 or 7, so they started off early. Classroom discipline during that time was strict, and it often involved corporal punishment. Most boys began an apprenticeship in a trade following grammar school, whether that's to be, a carpenter, a blacksmith, some type of apprenticeship in a trade after they finished. Sons of the nobility, the wealthy class, went on to go to college, universities, or the Inns of Court. Formal schooling was not encouraged for girls. We mentioned that a little earlier, unless they were children of the nobility. So unless you were in the wealthy class, school was not encouraged. For those who were educated, schooling primarily focused on chastity and the skills of housewifery, so how to be a housewife. Young girls were from wealthy families were often placed in the households of acquaintances, where they would learn to read, write, keep accounts, and manage a household and estate. So again, the emphasis on skills to be a quote-unquote good housewife. So now we're going to look at the Elizabethan theater. So even in an era when popular entertainment, which included public executions and cockfighting, theater became central to the Elizabethan social life. So playwrights and poets were among the leading artists of the day. They were very influential during that time because of the way during the Elizabethan era, playwrights and theater were relished. Theater companies traveled throughout England, and some were retained for private entertainment for the aristocracy. So at times, theater companies were pulled in to do private parties for the wealthy class. So with all of this, with all of the notoriety that the theater gained, it also attracted a lot of criticism, a lot of censorship and scorn from certain sectors of English society, mainly the religious sectors. The plays were often coarse and boisterous, and playwrights and actors belonged to a bohemian class, so this was frowned upon. It was almost looked at as sinful in many religious circles, so a lot of people within those circles wanted to close the theaters, censor the theaters, get rid of the theaters altogether, because they considered the actors to be questionable in terms of their character, because sometimes men played female roles, and that got into a whole issue of homosexuality and all these other things that took place within the the actual play themselves. There's also a fear of spreading disease, because oftentimes the theaters would be overcrowded. It would be so many people And that was another way for obviously disease to spread easily because you have so many people in this tight space, and obviously, people can catch diseases very easily that way. So Parliament kind of stepped in and did censorship for the plays because of the profanity, the heresy, or for politics. They didn't think that the opinions of these actors should influence other people because it could cause an uprising. So they wanted to censor the plays, and they actually did for a while. But Queen Elizabeth and later on King James offered protection that allowed the theaters to survive, so they moved those censors. Also, there were rules that prohibited construction of theaters within the London city limits. So they could not build theaters within the London city limits because they didn't want that element to be close to the city. So they had to kind of move it to the outskirts because of all the the other issues that came with the theater. A lot of people were drinking and getting drunk and loud, and it was a huge scene, if you will. So they wanted to move that outside the city, and because of the stigma that went along with the theater, they didn't want that to be tied with the city of London. Okay, so acting was not considered an appropriate profession for women in the Elizabethan era. So that's why you didn't see women within the theater. So the boys had to play female roles. And as we mentioned in the quiz, a lot of boys lost their jobs when they went through puberty and their voices became deep because then they could no longer sound like a girl. So many of the boys lost jobs as they moved through puberty. So they really got young boys to play female roles because of their voices, their size, their stature, things like that. So these Elizabethan theaters were makeshift. They're really dirty and loud, but attracted huge audiences. So it brought in a lot of money, a lot of visitors, helped with the economy. These performances lasted 2 to 3 hours a day and usually took place in the afternoon. Now, each section of the theater had a different price of admission. So depending on your class, that it kind of lets you know where you're supposed to sit. And so when you looked out into the theater, based on where you're sitting, you can tell where the nobility was, where the lower class people, where the merchants sat, because they typically are sectioned that way and they sat that way. And most of the theaters were round, so not only could you watch the performances going on, but you can also see the spectacles in the audience. People watch, see how people react, how they respond to the theater, and that sort of thing. All right, so eventually the Puritan Parliament, when they took over, closed the theaters and forbade stage plays. They said this was to appease and avert the wrath of God because they looked at it as very sinful and against the word of God, and they used religion to justify closing it. However, as we mentioned earlier, when King Charles II, he left out of fear of his life, he went to France, he came back, took over the English throne, and then reopened the theaters. Now, during this whole time where they wanted to get rid of these edicts that the Puritan Parliament put in place, this time period became known as the Restoration because of the fact that he wanted to restore England to its former place before the Puritan Parliament took over. So they reopened the theaters, they reinstated laws that were, enacted by the Puritan Parliament, and they just basically wanted to but basically put back into place laws that the Puritan Parliament had essentially closed, so to speak. All right, and that concludes this part of our discussion of part 2 of the Elizabethan Age. Make sure that you complete the Google form with all the questions. If you need to go back to the presentation, feel free to go back through the presentation, and this will kind of segue us into Shakespeare, specifically Taming of the Shrew. and we will use this presentation to connect it to the plays and looking at classism, religion, and how those things play out.